Good afternoon and welcome to Expel's first UK webinar. My name is Chris Waynforth and I lead the international business here at Expel. I'm joined by the hugely talented Ray Pugh, who runs our security operations function. Before we get going, I'd love to see in the comments where everyone is dialing in from. I'm in London right now, actually in Victoria to be exact. Ray, what about you? Where are you dialing in from?
So I'm in Haymarket, Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., so just across the pond.
Fantastic, not too far away. And I see a few comments. Have a look, see if there's any comments coming in. I think we're a little bit delayed here, so we'll welcome to live TV. So I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll let everyone get their comments in when they get a second. And please feel free to comment, ask any questions throughout the webinar, and we'll try our best to answer any questions as we go. Well, we've got our first one. So Nurul is dialing in from Bahrain. Welcome, sir. Nice to have you on the call. So if we move forward to the next slide, right, and we'll crack on and let everyone comment as they need to. I don't know if are you seeing a delay or is it just me?
In the slides themselves, I'm seeing our mission slide. Are you seeing that?
Okay, I am now, yeah. Thank you, Ray. Okay. So it's possible that you used the first time that you've heard from Expel in the UK, and actually that's intentional. We were founded in 2016 and we launched our first product 2 years later, products known as Workbench, and it's a class-leading security operations platform. As we grew, our customers in Europe, they joined us, and mainly through word of mouth and recommendation. And then in October of last year, we formally launched Expel in the UK, when we knew we would be ready to effectively deliver against our mission. Our mission being to make security easy to understand, easy to use, and easy to continuously improve. We do this at high quality and at scale. And when I joined, our EMEA customer list already included the likes of Virgin Atlantic, the Economist Group, and Matillion. So I knew we would be off to a good start. I started out in the UK as employee number 1, and since then we've grown that team to 1,100%. Or if you do the maths, the team of 12, and that's really just the beginning. The excitement and enthusiasm that we've seen from our new customers in EMEA and our existing customers as we engage with them over the last few months is palpable. With all of this in mind, I decided to ask Ray to come along and bring his knowledge and experience to the UK audience and provide a set of predictions and accompanying strategies for the next year. So where did all this data come from? Well, the data's aggregated across our global customer base, and it's made up of a mix of customers from those large enterprises with over 60,000 endpoints in some cases, all the way down to small organizations with just 250 endpoints. We took all of that information, our SOC leadership team did their analysis, and then we published it in our great eXpeltations 2023 threat report. For each of the top trends that we'll tell you what, for each of these top trends, we're going to tell you what we saw, how to detect those threats, and what to expect in 2023. Our goal for this webinar is to translate those events into a set of actionable security strategies that you can use to help you protect your organization from attack. With all of this in mind, I'm going to hand over to Ray, who will take you through the detail. Now, as I said earlier, get your comments and questions into the chat and we'll answer them as we go. Ray, over to you, sir.
All right, thank you very much for the warm introduction. You certainly set a high bar, so I'll do my best to live up to the expectation, but thank you for the invitation to spend some time with you as well as all of our audience members kind of going through our threat report for 2023. So basically, within the report itself, we, as Chris said, we're looking at trends and patterns from 2022 and then using those as a jumping point to look into 2023 and translate what we've been seeing in incidents that we've been responding to across our entire customer base, and how do we turn those into actionable insights that can help drive security strategy for various organizations. So as you can see on the slide, we've basically broken that into 4 primary buckets based on different attack surfaces and trends and patterns that we identified as we were going through that data as a SOC leadership team, as well as engaging a lot of our senior and principal level analysts that were very hands-on with a lot of this incident handling to derive those insights and capture them in detail in the report. So it would be really challenging to cover absolutely everything. So we tried to pick out some of the most interesting nuggets to share with you. So kind of in this order, we'll go over identity-based attacks, cloud platform security, ransomware, and then finally phishing before we wrap up our time together. So before we dive into the data, we wanted to just kind of take a step back for a moment and talk about Expel's SOC and just kind of more or less share a quick word about the team that makes sharing this report possible. So basically, we want to start by talking about how we have a team full of very passionate, talented men and women. And without their absolute dedication to protecting our customers 24/7, 365, every moment of every day, and all the hard work applied to stopping thousands of active threats each year, then we simply wouldn't have anything to write about. So, more or less, this team is foundational to everything we do here. So kind of moving to the next slide, we'd like to talk about the fundamentals of what make us successful as a SOC team. So starting with our core mission and some of those guiding principles along the way. So when it comes to notifying a customer of a threat, that's one thing, but we're constantly seeking to take that a step further and form, these genuine, true partnerships with customers, thinking of ourselves as extensions of the customer team. We're personally, whenever we talk internally, we're constantly looking for ways to improve, but in turn, we want to help our customers do the same. So whenever we identify an incident or a potential threat or risk, we want to turn that into actionable insight and a way to improve and potentially avoid that situation altogether at some point in the future and iteratively improve on that. So in order to do that and operate with success at its core, we have to have a strong SOC culture. That's absolutely essential. And we have many mantras that we kind of live and breathe as we operate. But teamwork makes the dream work is one that I think surfaces the most. As Chris said, we have our Workbench platform, which is our technology where the analysts do all of their work, collaborate with our customer team members, and respond to threats. So we're very, very interested in leading with technology and freeing up our analysts to do what people do best, exercising critical thinking and solving new, complex, novel problems, and doing so in a way that's genuinely collaborative at every step of the way. So being a place where the most talented analysts from diverse backgrounds want to come work, and people that have a passion for helping other people. So when it comes to whenever we have an opportunity to make new additions to our team, we prioritize personality traits. There's certainly a certain level of technical knowledge that's required, but those are things that can be taught, but it's much harder to change who a person is at their core. So we focus on who a person is, and kind of take it from there and mold them into an Expel analyst. Talking about SOC work, I know we have a room full of security practitioners here. So SOC work generates, I've been here at Expel working in the SOC for next month will be 5 years, which is hard to believe. I've certainly generated a lot of vivid memories along the way. So those in the audience that either currently or formerly have worked in a SOC at some point during their security journey, whether it's your first major incident or those jitters that you get before the first time you rotate through night shift and kind of delving into the unexpected. What are some of those standout memories that you've had along the way? If you'd please share in the chat, we'd be really curious to hear that. So this is, talking about the SOC and what makes, I'm obviously very biased. I think our SOC is special. I really enjoy these men and women that I work with every day. So I could spend the entire hour talking about this topic, but I don't know that Chris would be too thrilled with that. We have a lot of things that we want to get to. But basically tying this back to, the threat report, why we wrote it and why we want to come to forums like these and talk about it is we like to think of ourselves and then all of you as one big global community of defenders against threat actors, against our adversaries. So if each of you takes away just a single tidbit or nugget of information that helps your respective organization improve from a security standpoint, we're going to consider that a win, because that's what we're going for, is that constant improvement and operating as partners for positive change in the security community. All right. So moving into the report contents itself. So identity threat trends. So some of you may be wondering, whenever we say identity threat trends, what are we referring to? So you can kind of think of that as primarily BEC and BAC, so business email compromise, business application compromise. So the attacker end goal, whenever it comes to these threats, attempting to gain access to a user's identity in order to perpetuate fraud. So this is a criminal angle that generates billions of dollars in losses every single year, and it's continuing to grow year over year. This is not a new thing, and it's only expanding in our observation. And overall, 50%, so half of all of the incidents that we responded to last year were relating to identity threats. So we wanted to make that the first and foremost. This is public enemy number one, and this is the first thing we wanted to cover during our time together. And I guess talking about what it is, it's also important to talk about what it isn't as well. So a scenario that's not included in this context, just to clarify, is, for example, whenever an attacker compromises a VPN account to steal intellectual property or to deploy ransomware, that's not included in this specific bucket. But as you probably saw on the agenda, we're going to be talking about ransomware specifically, another very big, important item that's at the top of everyone's mind. So we'll be covering that in a subsequent section. Okay, so getting into the data. So we're making a distinction between BEC and BAC. So why go to that length to make that distinction is something that you may be wondering. So there's definitely some overlap in the attack angles themselves and in terms of gaining initial access. Bypassing MFA and some of the remediation steps overlap. But whenever you kind of dig at that and pull that thread a little bit further, it's, did the threat actor have access to email and email alone, or whether it was Okta or another identity provider, did they have access to potentially dozens of applications if everything is sitting behind Okta and they have access to all of those if they're able to gain that initial entry point. So at that point, whenever it comes to detection, response measures, as well as remediation and the cleanup after one of these events transpires, that's where that distinction becomes important in our minds. So that's something that we wanted to clarify up front, the reason that we feel it's important to talk about these two things in the same conversation, but also acknowledge the key differences. So
Richard,
for BEC, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Richard is asking, what's an example of payroll settings? So you talk
that's
about
an excellent. Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Richard. So we're actually going to be talking about one example, which is here in a couple of slides, which is we've saw an uptick around July of last year in, I don't think it was a brand new thing, but we saw a pattern across several customer environments in a short time frame where Workday account compromise became an angle where payroll settings were being updated in that human capital management system in order to divert people's paychecks. So that was an important thing that that goes beyond what would normally be just limited to business email compromise. That was an entirely different conversation with those customers. So I'll actually be detailing that example here in a couple of minutes, but that's a fantastic question. Thank you. So when it comes to remediation of these, business email compromise, it could be as simple as killing active sessions, forcing a password reset for that user or users if it's a campaign and multiple people were compromised, making sure that any inbox rules to move or divert incoming emails, those kinds of things. Whereas BEC, as we kind of talked about here a second ago, it could be going into those various applications, which applications were accessed, and then were any setting, whether it's the payroll system or others, were there any additional changes? So the response measures and then that cleanup and remediation could be different. Overall, as you can see on the chart, whenever we make that distinction and look at the data for 2022, BEC was the most pervasive by a wide margin, still almost 93%, but BAC was about 7%, which is still considerable and worth talking about. So another observable that we noticed whenever we were looking at the trends was legacy protocols using legacy protocols for the purpose of bypassing MFA. So when we're talking about Microsoft 365, for example, IMAP and POP3 protocols were enabled by default, and they don't support MFA. So in that case, even organizations, we're seeing patterns where organizations had MFA enabled, but if these legacy protocols were still allowed in the environment, MFA was not a silver bullet, and they were able to still authenticate to mailboxes. Fortunately, I believe it was around the October timeframe, but late last year, Microsoft began disablement of basic auth for Exchange Online, which is a great thing, but we noticed that instead of attackers, changing their ways, turning over a new leaf and getting day jobs, they decided to just shift their methods in order to adapt and try to maintain that competitive edge. So a new pattern that we saw this last year, especially following those changes, attackers used attacker in the middle framework, so AITM frameworks. EvilGenix or EvilJinx, if you prefer, basically allows stealing of credentials and session cookies as a subsequent way to bypass MFA and continue those campaigns. On this slide, we wanted to show an example alert that after an attacker gained access, so this is post-compromise, they registered a new MFA device in order to maintain persistent access, try to cover their tracks and limit the chances that they were going to be kicked out and playing the long game here. So this was an alert that we responded to related to one of these attacker in the middle compromises. When it comes to MFA and those types of measures, so temporary one-time password and MFA push notifications don't necessarily stop attacker in the middle phishing and session cookie theft. One thing I want to clarify, though, is that these MFA methods aren't completely ineffective. They're not obsolete, since they do help stop threats, if you think of credential stuffing or password spraying, things along those lines. But it's important to acknowledge that they're not you change that setting, get it implemented and deployed across your organization. It's not a silver bullet, and attackers do have workarounds like this method that we're talking about. And then it kind of gets into the conversation of, FIDO and certificate-based authentication, on the other hand, like those are considered strong auth, is what they're often referred to as. They are better against this vector, but it's also important to acknowledge whenever it comes to organizational rollout, it's not something that the majority of organizations in our experience have transitioned to at this point in time. So that's a consideration. Okay, so getting into our Workday for payroll fraud example that we talked about, so just kind of pulling at that thread a little bit further. We saw this, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. It was around July, so there was a period of several weeks where we saw a pattern where these were popping up in different customer environments, all within hours or days of one another, which was really compelling, and it certainly got our attention as we were seeing these and responding to them. So in some cases, it's if it's behind an identity provider, think Okta or similar. That's how Workday was accessed. Or in a business email compromise scenario, we even saw that using password reset measures. Once they had access to the email, they were able to step through password reset measures and gain access that way, which was clever, to say the least. So once that was achieved, we also saw kind of immediately, in order to cover their tracks and try to make sure they're not discovered and kicked out, creating things like inbox rules to delete incoming email notifications from Workday. So with their end goal being making payroll changes and diverting payment away from the person that's working hard to earn those dollars in that organization. They were creating inbox rules to move or delete, whether it's email subject or from a certain domain, move them to a different folder or delete them entirely, so that whenever they're updating settings, it's not going to tip off the security team and or the actual user who that account belongs to. We also saw enrollment of additional trusted devices, so another way to gain and maintain persistent access. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, we saw a couple different flavors. Some attackers chose to divert the entire paycheck and try to get as many paychecks as they could, or they would just take a small amount and hope they weren't noticed and play the long game and see if maybe that person wasn't checking their bank statements closely. So we saw a couple different flavors in there. But we thought this was worth covering as just one example and a pattern that we saw that ties back to why we chose to refer to BEC and BAC as similar but separate considerations when it comes to a security perspective. Okay, and our last slide for our identity threats section. Basically, as we said at the beginning, we want to make sure that they're turned into, these insights are not just gee whiz information that's interesting. We want to make sure that it's actionable and helpful whenever it comes to prioritizing your organization's roadmap. Where do we focus our time and attention and make investments into the future? So you can think of kind of this last slide in each section. Maybe get your pen and write it down type information. So kind of going through the short list, first we have deploying phish-resistant MFA. So when I say that, if FIDO-only factors for MFA aren't necessarily a near-term option or possibility within your organization, disabling things like email, SMS, voice, and temporary one-time passwords, and instead opting for push notifications, that's, in our opinion, a preferred method. If FIDO is not a near-term option, we think that is a step in the right direction. And of those available options, it's preferred. And then number two, implementing a pre-auth policy for network zones in Okta, and then there's similar functionality for other identity providers. Okta is what we have seen the most threats with and responded to the most with. So that's why we're referring to that in this context. So that kind of covers things like certain user groups. You can segment your organization, and if your finance team you feel like is especially susceptible to phishing attempts, you can have some more restrictive policies that designate specific network zones, authentication procedures, even length of session before they have to re-authenticate. Things along those lines can certainly be an additional layer, and we recommend looking into calibrating those settings to your preference. Also, consider blocking access to Okta from suspicious network zones. So there's certain ASNs, IP types, geolocation. This is similar to whenever you think Microsoft 365 conditional access policies have similar functionality. But if VPN use, for example, is not something that should occur in your organization, you can look at adding ASNs or IP attribution types, or even certain geolocations by country where authentication is blocked and not allowed. And then finally on this list, Okta does have an adaptive MFA capability, which it does similar things like calculations to say there's authentication attempts from these two locations that are not possible whenever it comes to the speed of an airplane. So that's something that is anomalous and suspicious. Unusual locations, new devices associated with each account, things like that. So there are, at an admin level, you can calibrate those settings to your respective organization as well. So that's another item that we recommend considering too. But all to say, since a few of these recommendations are very customizable and tailorable, and it kind of depends on your own environment, we'd ask that, you know, anyone that has had success in exercising some of these or other related measures, feel free to post any pro tips that you might have in the chat to help others.
That's a great idea. Hey, Ray, one other question I had was, you talked about business application compromise being 7% and then the rest being email compromise. Do we have a view yet on whether that BAC is growing over time? Do you see that pie changing?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. Looking into 2023, we do expect, and I guess that's also something that I should mention here at some point too, is we do have predictions for 2023 and beyond that we've included in the report. I'm not going to be covering those specifically, but that is one of the things that we foresee continuing to be something that is going to only grow into the future, because attackers are having success, and it is compatible with, you know, these opportunistic, financially motivated threat actors. There's a lot there that they can really make use of, and it is unfortunately been business is good for them. So I think they're going to continue. So we do believe so, but thank you for the question for sure. All right, our next major setting, or next major section, I should say, cloud platform security trends, what we're seeing, kind of speaking of things that are growing and something that we're seeing more of in 2022 compared to the prior year. So we're continuing to see attackers gaining access or compromising cloud resources in, you know, major providers, AWS, GCP, Microsoft Azure, and a mix of both opportunistic as well as more targeted type attacks. So things like exposed keys, stolen user credentials, public facing resources resulting in initial access. And in terms of attacker end goals, there is a variety. So we've seen things ranging from deployment of commercially available, or what we call mass commodity malware. We've also seen deployment to some of these resources of cryptocurrency miners. So, you know, the crypto market, I know, has taken a hit in recent months, but we're, you know, as that comes back, we're probably expecting to see more of those opportunistic type attacks, but also kind of a slightly different angle, and we'll kind of pull at these threads a little bit further, gaining admin access to the control plane as well. So data plane type threats as well as control plane type threats, establishing persistence, deploying new resources, and whether that's through the respective provider's web console or via API. We will dig into a couple of those observables here. But kind of taking a step back for a moment, I said it was growing, but it's growing considerably by our observation. So looking holistically at those major providers, and with this being our second annual report, so we have some really good data to compare this to from 2021. We saw these overall threats climb by 70% last year, which is really considerable, but I think overall makes sense as people migrate to the cloud and these become more used. We're also you know, as we've grown, we're monitoring more environments too. So that's an element in this, but it appears to be increasing very noticeably based on the data that we're seeing. And kind of as part of that, we've seen two main themes emerge as we delved into this data. So first being attackers targeted long-term access keys and service account credentials as a means for initial access. And attackers abused public-facing Amazon EC2 instances to perform SSRF or DNS rebind attacks in AWS, resulting in deploying attacker tooling and or malware. So SSRF being server-side request forgery, and then DNS rebind domain name system rebind attacks. of the cloud security incidents we responded to, so kind of focusing on that, we've been talking about malware deployment, about 20% resulted in deployment of cryptocurrency miners, and then 13% resulted in publicly available, commercially available commodity malware. So those were considerable. And then kind of referring to what we're showing here on the pie chart for a moment, of the attackers who gained access to cloud infrastructure, 56% did so through cloud configuration or application abuse, and 44% used compromised cloud credentials. So of the cloud credentials, focusing on that component here for a moment, we saw that 75% were through long-term access keys and service accounts, and then the remaining 25% were through cloud console credentials. That's hard to say. The three C's really get me, so I'm trying. So a question that you're probably wondering, which is exactly what we asked ourselves, was why do long-term access keys and service accounts make up such a large piece of this? And kind of we tied it back to, as we looked specifically at each of these incidents, and when we were able to determine how access was initially obtained from the attacker perspective, it's more often than not, because these credentials, in terms of long-term access keys, they're programmatically used to interact with cloud resources, which is, obviously different than like individual user credentials. So as a result, it dramatically increased the likelihood that they would be accidentally exposed when it comes to, if they're stored in a code repository that is accidentally made publicly available when it shouldn't be, or through version control software, other things along those lines. And then also, a contributor to this to some extent, successful SSRF and DNS rebind attacks can also expose these long-term access keys from the metadata service. And then for that remainder, the user credentials typically acquired through more traditional social engineering tactics. And then over here on the right-hand side is an alert, a sample alert that our analysts reviewed as part of one of these incidents within our Workbench platform for suspicious SSH key pair generation. And it was created, as you can tell, by the user agent there down at the bottom of that graphic. And it was generated using the AWS command line interface by the attacker. Now, if anyone out there is a visual learner like myself, talking about all of these things is one thing, and reading about them, but trying to come up with a way to visualize and kind of conceptualize these things in a way that is very easily consumable is something that we've been working on for a while. And so AWS is the first of the major providers that we integrated with. It's also the vast majority of environments that we currently monitor. So I'm showing that example here. We call it the AWS mind map. So basically we took certain common AWS API calls whenever we did have an active incident, or say a red team. Those are especially valuable because they let the attacker, in air quotes, run loose without remediation, so you get to see them progress whenever they otherwise would be stopped if it was the real thing. But these are the patterns of things that we saw whenever they land in an environment. They're trying to get the lay of the land and determine what they have access to and next steps. So we've also split that up by, kind of the attack kill chain, and visualized it here. So related to this topic, wanted to also note that another interesting observable in the data showed attackers favored proxy infrastructure in combination with when they had access to long-term credentials, and geolocation of those IP addresses that we saw for these actions that were taking place came from unusual locations as well. So this is something that we can't confidently predict whether this is a trend or pattern that's going to continue in the long run, but it's likely a good starting point because all of these events, it's really hard to determine what are the highest fidelity detections that are most likely to give a clue that something is amiss and we have an active threat. So comparing behavioral things with IP attribution that was used for access, we found as a valuable combination that has helped us detect these things early in the attack lifecycle and getting them stopped quickly has something that we found to be successful.
Ray, I think this is, if we could hear the screen to the other people, I reckon this is one of those get your pen moments, isn't it? A lot of screen grabs probably going on this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that is absolutely fair to say.
Yeah.
And kind of along those lines too, speaking of grabbing a pen, as we kind of wrap up our second of the 4 major sections we'll be covering today, we've talked a lot about cloud platform security trends, but that's cool, Ray. What's the so what? What should I go do now? We're going to talk about that here for a second. So avoid using static identity and access management credentials in favor of short-lived, perishable, just-in-time access credentials that cycle. So you can think of IAM roles in AWS, or when it comes to GCP, for example, service account impersonation. And then number 2, periodically rotate permanent access keys. As part of that, if your permanent access keys are accidentally exposed, especially because you're probably not going to know that they're exposed until they're being used to try to access your environment, configuration to have scheduled rotations at certain intervals to limit the time frame an attacker could use those access keys is a really valuable thing. Where it could be, if you find retrospectively that there was a period of time that those were exposed, they'll cycle and you will have an end date where the attacker would then hopefully lose access. That's another additional layer. So that's one of our pro tips relating to number 2 on the screen. You're going to hear us say MFA a lot, MFA all the things. So no different for this one. Enforce MFA for access to cloud consoles. And then in general, limiting root access and usage to only when it's absolutely essential. So just, clean security hygiene and having good habits along those lines is definitely something that we suggest. But having said that, there's a lot of more granular detail, especially with what you're seeing here on the screen, detailed further in the report beyond what I could hope to cover verbally during our time together. But in addition to that, if you have any keen insights relating to these 4 things or anything in addition that you found success with, and you'd like to share that with everyone else that's listening, please feel free to do so in the chat.
And Ray, I think there's a blog that we posted back end of last year, specifically around rotation of permanent access keys. So if you want to...
Absolutely, yes, that's a great point. We try to a lot of these things that we talk about, we try to especially whenever we're seeing a pattern, we try to pretty rapidly publish blog posts that give recommendations, and then a lot of those things end up in the report. But so that you don't have to wait till the end of this coming year, we're going to continue to try to do that. So yes, that's a very good point as well. Okay, another riveting topic that is definitely something that has everyone's attention in the security community that we wanted to make sure that we covered. We're going to talk ransomware here for a moment. It's certainly a top priority for a lot of organizations that we talk to, for very good reason. It is a very high impact thing whenever a ransomware threat lands in an environment. And then from our perspective as a 24/7 MDR provider, our goal is to stop these attacks early in the attack lifecycle to the left of actual ransomware activity, because it doesn't really take any special tools or skills to realize that there's mass disruption in the environment. A bunch of files have been encrypted, and at that point it's too late. So from our perspective, we spend a lot of time and energy talking about pre-ransomware activity. So things that would result in ransomware deployment, detecting them early, stopping them early, and figuring out also from a what we call environmental resilience vantage point, how to prevent these threats or reduce their ability to have success whenever they are attempting to be deployed in an environment.
It's an interesting point you make, because I've certainly seen in my experience in the UK that the hackers or the attackers will go for the ransom before they've even deployed a line of code, right? They'll start asking for money on the threat and getting ahead of things. So actually being able to know what and how they might infiltrate or expose, then getting ahead of that is really helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely, because you know, attackers are looking to do the least work possible in order to achieve their end goal, right? So it makes sense, absolutely.
They can send the letter and send the cut up pieces of paper on a sticky whatever, and ask for money and get the
Yes,
Bitcoin before they've done anything, and happy days, right?
exactly. And then yes, and then you know, and then cut their week short at that point whenever they
Yeah,
have
exactly.
success, right?
I just want to acknowledge, so Richard, thank you for you've made some good points on the notes about you know, some top tips. You know, obviously blocking by geolocation. Just talking about the previous point is a great point, especially when it comes to access control.
Absolutely. So in terms of the TLDR, when it comes to ransomware, or I should say pre-ransomware activity, it was looking at all incidents and where this fit in. For our 2022 data, it clocked in at 11% of all incidents. That is up 7 percentage points from 2021. So that's pretty significant, I think, to say the least. And basically, the way that, as you can see here on the chart, it's pretty compelling, where almost nearly 98% of those, it was the result of self-installation techniques on Windows-based systems. And that's up more than 14 percentage points compared to 2021. And so what do we mean whenever we say self-installation? So that requires employee or end user interaction. So a couple, you know, top of mind common examples would be unintentionally installing malware. So, you know, okay, there's a zip file that was in this email. It contains a malicious executable. I'm going to open that, run it, because I think this is a legitimate business thing. Similarly, things like malicious macros and Office docs. So these aren't, you know, exploitation of vulnerabilities. That does happen some, but for us, it was less than 3% of the overall data. And then another interesting note was, of all malware incidents, because obviously malware can be used to do a number of different things, it was almost a third, 32%, tied back to ransomware operations, where the end goal would have been ransomware deployment. So we felt like that was a really compelling data point to share as well. So I guess true to form, the summary is this was something that we saw more of, and we expect to see more of it as we look into 2023.
It sounds like Richard's earlier comment around adding security training to the teams is you know,
yes.
if it's 90% is self
Exactly.
then you know, same old problem, right?
Exactly. It's that certainly goes a long way, and especially whenever our final section will be phishing, we'll talk about the importance of training, but it kind of covers everything. Attackers, you know, it never fails that at least one person is going to provide that information they weren't supposed to, or open and run that file, you know, click on things they shouldn't. That's something that it's kind of a tried and true thing. It's not a new thing, but they still enjoy great success in using it to get that initial foothold, for sure. So since when it comes to ransomware, like just this topic of self-installation being the favorite, and it seems to still be working pretty well for the attackers, you know, accounting for, again, almost 98% of all ransomware incidents we identified. We wanted to kind of show a split of, you know, by percentage, what were, you know, the file types or media types, I should say, since removable media was included in our data as we looked at this further. So zip JavaScript being, you know, the vast majority of the time. A really interesting data point that we noted, in contrast to whenever we were looking at this same threat vector in 2021, is that ISO file. So third from the right, I'm sorry, second from the right, third from the left, accounted for, you know, it was used for delivery in 12% of all ransomware incidents. And it didn't even register to make our list in 2021. So we felt like that was compelling. whenever we, again, took a step back and asked ourselves why, we believe that it was partially due to Microsoft making some positive changes and making it easier to block macros in files downloaded from the internet. So the kind of historical attacker favorite of VBA macros, Excel 4.0 macros, to gain initial access in Windows-based environments, that became slightly less fruitful. So they kind of pivoted, and ransomware operators shift their tactics in order to, gain that competitive edge and increase their likelihood of success. And it kind of falls into that theme of, they're not looking to go get day jobs, it seems, which is unfortunate. But it's just, kind of that age-old thing where as we evolve as defenders, have better security hygiene, get better at detecting and mitigating certain threat types, attackers in turn change their tactics to stay a step ahead. All right. When it comes to, ransomware trends and how to protect your organization, I know your notepads are probably filling up at this point, but I feel like this section is pretty important, especially when it comes to ransomware. Some things that you can do to help reduce risk or potentially mitigate some of these completely. So number one being configuring JavaScript, Windows script files, and HTA files to open with Notepad. So by associating these file extensions with Notepad, it mitigates a pretty common entry point for malware to include some of the tactics that we see with ransomware, but holistically malware in general. Another one with ISO file extensions becoming a pattern that we started to see, especially the second half of last year. Consider unregistering ISO file extensions in Microsoft Windows Explorer. And then at that point, Windows will no longer recognize ISO files. You won't be able to, an end user won't be able to double click and execute them. Number three is, this comes more into play whenever we see exploitation, which is not the primary vector, but it is something that we do see pretty consistently. Making sure if there's no legitimate business need for systems to have RDP open to the internet, don't expose it, close it. Things like password spraying and things along those lines can be another entry point. I know it's not what we focused on during this conversation, but another thing to help reduce risk. Disabling macros, that's an old favorite. Disabling those for files downloaded from the internet. This is transitioned to, it's a setting by default from Microsoft, but we suggest going and double checking to make sure that is not enabled within your organization. And then, kind of patch and update regularly whenever it comes to, these new exploits and just vulnerabilities in general. Making sure that everything is patched and updated regularly, and being able to do so, is obviously linked to sound inventory management, knowing which services or applications are running on which assets, and just having a methodical process for going through and, on a normal cadence, making sure everything is patched and up to the latest and greatest version.
So Ray, on number three, I think you just come up with a new trademark phrase, right? Don't expose it, close it. I like that.
Yes, that's catchy. I guess we'll make a bumper sticker. Exactly. We'll have to follow up on that one. That's a good idea. I love it. All right, trying to get this slide to change. There we go. And finally, I know I've said a lot. Thanks for bearing with me thus far. A lot to cover. We're going to be talking phishing here for a moment, just to kind of close out for a final section for the day. And we wanted to make sure that this was included. We do have a managed phishing service where we get the benefit of seeing a lot of user-reported email submissions. So, if you're in your organization, somebody hits that report to phishing button. That's something that we monitor for a number of our customers, as well as various secure email gateway integrations as well. So we want to take that data to share and inform, especially because it's a tried and true long time favorite. Phishing tactics are alive and well. And spoiler, credential harvesting, continues to be a heavy favorite. And 2022 was no different, so it's alive and well. So the TLDR for phishing is 4 successful phishing attempts, so actual compromise that we saw resulting from malicious emails. 88% were tied to credential harvesters. And so if we think back to our earlier conversation about, business email compromise, business application compromise, this makes sense. So using credential harvesters to get the credentials to perpetuate those campaigns. So this is the vast majority of the time how the attackers actually gain that information in order to perpetuate those campaigns. Our data shows that this is nothing new, but so there's kind of new variations, but it kind of falls in the same vein of emails that refer to, this is time sensitive, it requires action. A lot of times financially driven things, especially targeted at people who in their job role handle finances or invoices or things along those lines. That's where attackers continue to have success. This is, thanks to Richard for calling out that end user education is so important. And so, I mean, it's kind of it boils down to one of those things where from their perspective, why make a change if it's still working, right? And then looking at the industries, we monitor a lot of customer environments that go across a lot of different verticals and industries. We wanted to look at this data and see if certain industries were more targeted by others than others. I don't think any of these were particularly surprising to us, with hospitality, finance, legal services topping out the list. As you can see, hospitality was by a wide margin. So again, taking a step back, why do we believe that's the case? And whenever we look at these examples, it showed that organizations, and especially job roles within those organizations, but where a large majority of that organization is geared towards interacting with third-party vendors in some cases. So the ability to pose as a third-party vendor, and make it seem like it's legitimate correspondence talking about finances or shipping or something along those lines, was really the big key there, where customer, end user interaction. So with specific customers in hospitality, talking to various individuals who might have questions, having customer service people that are really passionate about helping people, want to be responsive, and maybe not taking a step back to say, well, does this question really make sense? Or are they asking me to, download this file or input my credentials into this weird third-party site in order to access this file they're referring to? Kind of jumping before thinking is something that came into play for all the cases that we analyzed. Something that's really interesting that is a good thing to see is these organizations that are, generally more susceptible or more heavily targeted, I should say, they were also more likely to have phishing simulations, because as part of what we're monitoring, we see people reporting those phishing simulation emails that are posing as something malicious in the interest of exercising that good security hygiene and educating, employees and end users. So they're really investing in, user-based education, which does pay dividends. We've seen positive results in the organizations that make that investment. And it's, particularly important in certain industries where they are more targeted.
Richard makes a good point about the use of ChatGPT to make phishing emails more perfect, should we say, and less likely to be noticed as.
It's a scary thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably a webinar for itself, right? And we've only got 3 minutes left, so
okay,
so maybe we shouldn't go down there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm getting long-winded. I'll try to wrap up here this section quickly and then hand it back over to you. But I'm sure everyone's notepads are very full at this point. We just have a couple more recommendations we want to make. So running MFA wherever possible. We've talked about this in a couple of previous sections. If feasible, phish-resistant security keys as part of that reduces risk even further when it comes to credential theft. Second, if you're not running a SEG or secure email gateway, that is a useful tool for both filtering incoming threats, creating custom rules to calibrate it to your organization's needs, as well as some of the remediation measures. When something makes it through, you can block certain things and or hold certain file types for admin review, things along those lines. We recommend considering that. Employee training, I don't think we need to talk about that anymore. We've talked about it a whole bunch, but we do believe that's very important. And then things like email anti-spoofing controls, DMARC, SPF, DKIM. They don't stop everything, but they're effective in stopping some of these threats. And finally, since this was Chris's idea to do a total wrap up of everything, he's such a nice, generous guy. So all of these recommendations, if you want to just take a single screenshot, they're all detailed in our report, but everything we talked about in terms of these recommendations, like, we believe this is the most important thing. We want actionable takeaways for everybody. Kudos to anyone that was taking notes along the way, but wanted to provide us a summary and roll up here. Again, we've also included predictions for looking into the future, not just retrospectively in the report. So there might be some interesting things to read there. So would suggest checking that out. But with that, I've really enjoyed this time. Chris, thank you for setting this up and inviting me. I've had a great time. But with that, I'll pass it back over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. If you could go to the next slide for me, sir. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Ray, what an amazing job. I mean, 17 actionable insights and strategies for the coming year. I think I can actually see people looking at this saying, right, these are our projects to crack on with. And thank you very much for making my life easy. We don't need to come up with this. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. As Ray said, I'm sure you've all probably taken screenshots or written things down. But the webinar has been recorded. So if you want to watch it again, then drop into certain points. And thank you, Richard. Then you can. And also, if you get in touch, we'll send you the full report. And then that again includes all the full details for you. And if we can just go to the next slide, that would be great. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Those of you based in the UK that want to heading along to the Cloud and Security Expo in March, then we are there. It's actually going to be our first formal trade show as Expel UK in just a few weeks' time. So come along. You can use that link there to put yourself a demo on the stand. We would absolutely love to have you there. And thank you very much, everybody. That's a wrap.